Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's great to see you.
Good morning. Wow, do you feel accomplished now that we finished those four stories of healing?
Well, yes, we do. And I can't believe at the pace we are moving. And so I'm delighted. Again, we discussed about demons and the prophet Isaiah. And I still found I still find it so interesting that, as we discussed last week or earlier this week, 53 has so much of passage, but Matthew chose this one verse, which
Yeah,
again, which I think from your perspective, you said it's positive. From my perspective, I think it's not that positive. Like the verses where it said that God ordained him to be crushed or God ordained him to go through pain, that to me would be more powerful because I think he
well,
bore up.
and that is cited, right? As we mentioned, the suffering servant a poem is cited 11 times by the New Testament. And so it definitely is cited. And we noticed how it was cited almost verse by verse. Like there's almost, once you get to chapter 53 of Isaiah, most verses are cited. Nonetheless, Matthew, not interested in prophecy fulfillment. Again, this has to do with the nature of prophecy fulfillment as an editorial note that's meant to convince people of things. And I think that that's not something that Matthew was trying to push off as the Jesus narrative. It's interesting, and we talk about this sometimes. Who is Jesus? So we just finished Jesus as the healer. And anyone who reads Matthew wants you to know that Jesus is a healer. We're about to go, especially next, where we're going to see at the end of chapter 8, we'll see Jesus the miracle worker or the savior, kinda, and then we'll also get a lot more healing stories, but also a lot more parables as we go on. And these parables, for me, there's no parallel today to a person who's a parable giver. You know, if someone's to give a parable giver today, I'd be so annoyed. I'd be like, I don't know what you're saying. I can't understand this. Just tell me what you mean.
But isn't that the main purpose of a parable? Because it's meant to have multiple meanings. It's not meant to have a meaning. It could have multiple interpretations, or it's open to interpretation.
So I would say that is, from my perspective, that is not the purpose of a parable. The
Okay.
purpose of a parable is not to give you multiple perspectives, it's meant to give you a very concrete lesson in a very easy to hear way.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, but I feel that the problem with Jesus is that exactly what you said. He gives these parables that to this day we have different scholars, theologians, and priests and ministers saying, well, it means this, it means this. And it's very complicated. We had many that we saw, was it at the end of chapter 7 and other places where we're like, it's just unclear what they mean. And if anything, that's a bit of a complicated situation because when we talk about you are salt of the earth in chapter 5, or you are light of the world, the city built on a hill, to this day, we'll have thousands of interpretations, and it's just a complicated matter. But that's the nature of biblical text or religious text versus the nature of parable. A parable is something that's meant to be easily understood by kids, where a religious parable is meant to be eternal and
Mhm.
eternally pertinent to different generations. Okay, so we'll only do one verse today, but we'll jump right into chapter 8:18.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 8, verse 18. Now, when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side.
Okay, Isaac, other side of what?
That's a great question. Because the earlier part, he was in Peter's house, right? And so verse 14 was he was in Peter's house, he healed them, they brought people to him. Again, the way I read this is he was in the house, maybe around him, the neighbors, people in the neighborhood they brought the sick to him and he healed them. So when I think of the other side, then maybe we have to go back to Matthew 8, verse 1. He came not from a mountain, probably the other side of the mountain. Now, I do
Oh,
not.
wow. Let me go back to that. So Matthew 8, verse 1, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. You're going all the way back to that? He's at a house.
Well, yeah. So is it possible that the house was near a mountain, and now he's saying, "Let's go across to the other side," as in the other side of the mountain? I think that's one interpretation. But to answer your question, I don't know, and I haven't thought about this so far until you asked me
So,
this question.
so Isaac, why didn't you think about this? Anyone who reads this verse, uh, if you read this verse, you're kind of stuck. He was literally just that evening the last thing is not at Peter's house, but in 8:16 and 17, it says that evening they brought to him many who were possessed. So that could be at Peter's house, that could not. We noted that when you compare this to Mark, that the story is placed in Matthew after the Beatitudes, but in
Mhm.
Mark, it's really the beginning of his ministry is being a healer, and that probably has to do with the different attitude of Mark versus Matthew to Jesus' healing ministry. So over here, I think that it's actually very clear what the other side was, but it's so interesting. What I want to note for you is that no person who reads Matthew can know. So that's why the reason you don't know is because the way Matthew is written, it's impossible to know. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at two verses from Mark and Luke, and you're going to be like, oh, okay, I know exactly what that is. So let's
Mhm.
go flip to Mark. I don't know if you got your handy dandy Bible taken from a hotel or spot on or taken from a church in your hand. But if you do, please flip to Mark
Yeah.
4:35. In Mark 4:35, this
Mhm.
happens. It says in Mark 3, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side, again, ambiguous, and leaving the crowd behind, they took him with him in the boat, just as he was. Other boats with him, a great windstorm. And this is the beginning of the story of what we're going to see later in 8:23, that the boat, they got on the boat and they traveled to across the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee, really the Lake of Galilee, is around 13 miles one way, 7 miles the other way. So not super big, but if you want to travel, my wife and I, one time when we were in Israel, we just wanted to drive around the whole lake, see how long it took. So we drove around. It took like an hour. It was not a short trek, but it's not a long trek. And it's really beautiful. You get to go all the way around the lake and see different cities in Israel at the time. Some are kibbutzim. One is Tiberias, a very famous city. So the lake is both very, very small in perspective of like compare it to a Great Lake or compare it to the Mediterranean Sea. But it's big in the perspective of if you live there, that's your lake, and you're not swimming across it. You can see to the other side. But, it's very low. I think it's 700 meters below sea level. So it's surrounded by mountains. Technically, if the Mediterranean Sea ever had a tidal wave and flooded and it could get over those mountains, it technically could flood it. But it's freshwater lake coming from the Jordan River. So what's interesting when you read Mark 4:35, it's so clear. And if that wasn't clear enough, because it is parallel to our verse in Matthew, going outside, if you look at Luke 8:22, even clearer. One day he got into a boat with his disciples and he said to them, let us go across the other side of the lake. So they put out, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep, windstorm, and we'll get to that story, I don't know, next couple weeks. So what we see in Mark and Luke, Mark, you have a parallel verse, which is somewhat equally ambiguous, but you could tell from the next verse that it's referring to him going across the lake, which would have been, several miles. And then when you look at Luke, it's made even clearer. He's going across the lake several miles. So now the question we throw back to you, Isaac. Now we know in Matthew exactly what this is referring to. That verse, now what you just read, 8:18. Now, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go to the other side. He gave orders to who? Not to the crowds. He gave orders to his disciples, according to Mark
Disciples.
and Luke. And the other side meant to go to the middle of the ocean in order to get away from them. Okay. So now we made two great discoveries. One is that he's talking to disciples and trying to get away from the crowds.
Mhm.
And number two, this is talking about the lake. So now we have another question for you, Isaac. Why is Jesus trying to get away from the crowds?
That's
Jesus, if anything, what happened in the immediate verse before in 8:16 and 17? Not only is he around crowds, because he's around crowds all the time. Don't forget, we already saw in 8:1 that you just cited when Jesus had come down, great crowds followed him. There are great crowds following him everywhere. And
Mhm.
obviously they can't follow him into the lake because
Mhm.
they'll drown and it's hard, you can't just swim for miles. So that wasn't a possibility. But we already see in 8:16 that evening they brought to him many who were possessed with demons, and he cast out the spirits of wind and cured all who were sick. They're bringing him people all the time. There are crowds, 8:16, they're bringing people. 8:1, he has crowds all around him. And what does Jesus do? He runs away. He goes into the one place where the crowds can't follow him. He takes his disciples. He's not by himself. But he takes. So my two questions for you now, Isaac, is number one, why is Matthew written in a way that's impossible to understand? Don't forget the way that the synoptics worked is that Matthew was the Bible or the New Testament for the Matthean community. They didn't necessarily see Mark or Luke, and in different times in Christian history, this would have been the book used for a community. So if Matthew was used by a Christian community, they may not have the benefit of our synoptic parallels and would have no way in hell of understanding this verse. So my first question for you is, why is this verse written in this way that is impossible to understand? And then number two, why is Jesus running from crowds?
That's again, thank you for highlighting these questions. I had not thought of them before. As a good Christian, I know.
So I'm being unfair, Isaac, because I definitely thought of it before, right? So
Yeah.
I'm putting you on the
So
spot.
yeah, so what I find interesting to a point, right? So Jesus does draw away from the crowds, but there are also instances where the crowds follow him. Like Sermon on the Mount, it's called a Sermon on the Mount, as in he went up to a mountain where people followed him. And so is it also possible that, I would imagine back in the day with these crowds around him, it's not easy to speak, as in to preach a message. Maybe move to the mountains, knowing that people will follow him. It'll give a platform where you can have more reach. And so maybe Matthew was being direct in saying Jesus moved to the mountains so that it's more accessible, can follow them, but could also be that as a human being, maybe he was a bit more introverted. Like I can seem to understand with that, where the crowds being with them, it can be drainful, I mean, being around people all the time can be exhausting. And there are times where you just want to go away to be by yourself, so you feel a bit refreshed and renewed. So it could be both of those reasons, or there could be something else outside of it,
It's interesting, Isaac. One thing that you fall back on is Jesus the person. And you feel comfortable saying, listen, even if you're a Messiah, you still
Yeah,
got to go to sleep, still got to eat dinner, you still got to go to the bathroom, you still got to live a normal human life. As long as you're in the physical world, you're stuck by the physical constraints of reality.
right,
So it's
yeah.
interesting that you fall back on that very, very easily, saying, listen, Jesus was tired. Jesus didn't need the crowds around him 24/7. It was too much for him. So it's interesting. I don't know, as a reader of text, how comfortable I feel about this, but I definitely understand
So
and could sympathize with that
could you tell me
perspective.
more? So could you tell me more? So what?
Well,
So
I don't know. I just feel that when you talk about Jesus in the New Testament, he's viewed as bigger than life and bigger, like Michael Jordan. When I don't know what he did at night. I only know what he did in games. And when we write a biography about him, we don't care about all his gambling and stuff on the side. Like his greatness was specifically in basketball. So Jesus, like his greatness is in from the New Testament in messiahship. So when you tell me like, oh, he had crackers for dinner, or he was exhausted, it almost feels like it's off narrative. It shouldn't be written in this. This text is not for that, even though it's true. So that's kind of how I feel.
yeah, it's a great observation. But I think with what Kristen had probably the first season ago as well, by historically people believe have said him, or early church fathers have portrayed him to be fully God and fully man. And so to your point, right? If the Bible didn't have any share of him being as a human being, as in going through all the things which human beings do, then I feel like that's also the main pull of Christianity, as in Jesus was God, but he was also man, and as a man, he lived this life. But that I think would chip away, I would think, at one of the core tenets of Christianity. And so to answer your question, from a Christian perspective, having viewed him as God and fully man, it does allow us to go back and forth to kind of fall back on in certain places from the human perspective, and certain places on him being the Messiah, or him being the God man.
Okay, that definitely would fit the narrative. So we usually don't look at the commentary of the church fathers. So I just want to note two of them for this. So number one, I think to deal with what you noted, that you said, well, maybe it's 8:1, maybe it's from the mountain. So Augustine talks about this. I think it's Augustine, right? And he says, it is clear that this day in which they went over the lake was another day, and not that which followed the one on which Peter's mother-in-law was healed, on which day Mark and Luke relate that he went out into the desert. So first of all, this is one of the things that we don't generally talk about. It's really hard to figure out the chronology of Jesus' life and ministry. And this is not only a Jesus problem. This is also a Old Testament problem. There's a very famous dictum in the Pentateuch that Rashi will, we quoted Rashi yesterday, and we'll probably quote Rashi again today. The Rashi points out multiple times in the Hebrew is ein mukdam umuchar b'Torah, which means there's no chronological order to the Bible. What that means is that if it makes sense that this thing took place right after that thing, then we accept that.
That is
But
very
if
true,
it
right?
doesn't make sense,
Isn't
then
that
it's
a
okay
fact? Yeah,
if we
isn't
cut
that
and
a
paste into different places. Yeah, I'm sorry.
isn't it a statement of fact? As in the Bible, it's not chronological. We think it's chronological, but it's not necessarily chronological. Certain places can be chronological to give this a to give this a theme, but it's not going to be sequential or chronological.
Well, it's interesting because obviously some of the Bible is chronological. Like when you look at the whole book of Genesis, the whole book of Genesis is purely chronological. The whole first half of the book of Exodus is purely chronological. And then you get into like, I think once you get to immediately the Jews, the Israelites being freed from Egypt, that's when the problem did. I think one of the first issues that I remember is that Moses' father-in-law, Reuel or Jethro, and it says that did he come right then or did he come later on into the desert encampments? Because it says that Jethro visited Moses and gave some advice about court systems. So certain people say that was happened here. Some people say others. Also, when was the tabernacle built? There's this narrative happened before something or after. So I think this is something that in the Pentateuch, at least, is something that we say that things have in order. But like I'll be honest, when you get the Kings, it's all in order. When you get the Joshua, independently, it's all in order. So these are things that I think that when we look at the New Testament, I would assume that each individual book, like Matthew, was read as a chronological work. But the problem is when you compare the synoptics, right? When you now have to stick Mark and Luke into it, it's more unclear about, well, obviously that story that looked like what happened with Peter and the demons, it looked like it happened on the Sabbath. And that looked like it happened in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And it's definitely unclear to say the least.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when you mean chronological, you mean as in that these events happened before, right? So even within Genesis, one could argue like the whole creation thing, where I've heard people pick up on the sequence. Did this happen first? That happened first. But what you're saying is the broad narrative of Genesis happened first before Exodus. The broad narrative
Well,
of
no,
Exodus.
I mean that, but I mean the story of Exodus is chronological in that it starts with day one, goes to day two, goes to year one, goes to year two, goes to year 100, goes to year 1,000. It goes in order of years. Yeah. Okay. This is something that when Augustine says it, it's something to think about. Okay, so let's go back to our two questions. Our first is why is Matthew written in such a way that is unclear? And
Mhm.
I'll even just strengthen that question. If you look at the way that Matthew 8:23 is written, it says, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. There's no sense that Jesus kind of is this is not brought about by the disciples. Jesus says in 8:18, he gave orders to go to the other side, and they follow him. When you look in Mark and Luke, you don't really get that same exact sense because Mark, let's bring it up again. Uh, he said, "Let us go across," and then they left. They took with him in the boat. It almost feels like the in Mark and Luke, the disciples were more active, kind of making decisions. But over here, it seems that Matthew is just they're just following. So our first question again is, how come it's written in such an unclear way, and such that the story of Matthew in 8:18 is completely separate from 8:23, the story of the calming of the storm, and we have two parables, which we'll do in the future in between. So that's our first question. Our second question is why was he running away? When we see the synoptic parallels, we see clear he's running away and just keeping his disciples. Why is he running away from the crowds? Okay, so let us answer the second question first, because I think there's a really interesting perspective that we can give on this. So you mentioned one possible answer that Jesus possibly he's a man, he's exhausted, it's overwhelming to be around the multitudes for so long. So another possibility is that Jesus wants to avoid crowds,
Mhm.
and specifically maybe the people that he is getting the most amount of attention from, than people who had evil spirits or people who had demons and the sick, because he was being so praised and so raised up that that was against not only Jesus the man, but about one of the I think, main goals that we see in the Beatitudes and throughout Jesus' life is that he can't be raised on a pedestal
Hmm.
to be praised. The kingdom of heaven should be praised. So I think there's one thing that I would like to differentiate or bifurcate. Is it good to praise Jesus or is it good to praise the kingdom of heaven? So I think that Jesus, it seems, would be against you saying that he's this person who deserves praise. He says, I'm like the representative. I'm the one who's bringing this about. I want you to be a different person. I want you to see the world differently. So I think when Jesus was put in these situations where it was natural for him to get praise, he was trying to lead by example of showing that it's not proper to kind of be in a place where the crowds are always kind of seeking you out, not because it's bad to have a ministry or have followers, because of what that means for the person who's getting this either egotistical boost or have the people missing the message. Okay, so that is one perspective. It's not automatically right, but I just want to give you maybe to start a rabbinic context of that. And I think that there's this really, really, did I close it? I totally close it. There's this really interesting perspective that I believe I saw it in Rabbi Sachs. And I'll tell you the Talmudic background, and I'll tell you what Rabbi Sachs says about it. But I think it really helps to for us to understand this. And I totally closed it, so I don't have it in front of me. But in short, there's a very famous first going on second century rabbi named Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. We've mentioned him many times. He has this very famous line where he says that if you compare certain of my students to the rest of the world, that the students will be viewed as so important that you won't even be able to see how the rest of the world will be equal. So he says, for example, that if you put them on a scale, every single rabbi and every person in the world on one side, and you put Elazar and Hyrkenus on the other one, the scale would go like this. Elazar and Hyrkenus would be more weighty, and that's generally viewed as great and like he's greater in God's eyes. And then another person came along, no, if you put Elazar ben Hyrkenus on this side, so everyone's on this side, and Elazar ben Hyrkenus on the side, and you put Elazar ben Arach, another rabbi on the side, it'll go like this. So these are really, really great praises. They're saying that these people are really worth, at least in God's eyes, what everyone else in the whole world is worth. So these are the highest praise. So Rabbi Sachs points out, what is the end for these two rabbis who are put on the scale? Where Elazar ben Hyrkenus was eventually exiled. He was the most famous exile person. The story goes, in short, that the rabbis ruled, he ruled against them, and then he refused to teach like them. So they said, if you're not going to be part of our team, you're exiled. So, and he didn't change his mind, and he died in exile. So that's one. And then the second, Elazar ben Arach, as the story goes, it said that he followed his wife. Sorry, let me bring it up. He followed his wife after he had to. Here it is. Okay, so he followed his wife when she decided that they have to move to another town, and therefore, while all of his other colleagues and disciples would have lived in Yavne, the very famous place where all the rabbinic leadership moved when the temple, one of the places they moved when the temple was destroyed, he moved to a city named Emmaus, where was the residence where his wife lived, and it was a beautiful place. It was really nice. It was blessed with good water. It had a pleasant climate. It had warm baths. But then he forgot all his Torah. He forgot everything. So the two people that were praised most highly are the two people that are viewed in the first and second century, or it was the third, but as being like kind of the bottom of the barrel. So Rabbi Sachs points out that a lot of times when you give praise, it can be destructive. And these two people, it wasn't necessarily the praise that was destructive. It was that fact that one was ruling against all his colleagues and going his own way. The other one left his colleagues. When you don't have that interaction with the masses, you fall apart. So we
Yeah.
see
Hmm.
in the Jesus narrative, you see these 2 points. One, you see that it could be he didn't want the praise. And when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was giving such, oh, I said Shimon Bar Yochai. When I said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was giving this high praise to these two rabbis, what it meant, it was destructive to them. It made them think that they could live like on an island, isolated, and they couldn't. So I think when we look at Jesus' actions, we could definitely put in this perspective that he wanted to avoid that praise. He wanted to avoid a situation like that. And we see in Mishle, which is Proverbs in 27:12, there's a verse that says, if someone blesses his neighbor in a loud voice early in the morning, it will be considered a curse to him. Why is it considered a curse? Because if you do that, it'll be seen by other people, and other people might want to take advantage of that person as well. So praise is like this double-edged sword. So also Rav Dimi in the Talmud Bavli in Arach 16a, he says that one should never sing his fellow praises because doing so leads to criticism. So praise has two consequences. One, it can make more people jump onto your bandwagon. Number two, it can make more people feel that they have to attack you and criticize you. So there's lots of reasons that Jesus would have wanted to avoid the additional praise. So it's interesting. He would retreat with his disciples into a place where he felt he could, like Isaac says, feel like he could rejuvenate, feel alone, where with his disciples, he could kind of have that center of a group where he doesn't have that endless praise and he doesn't have that endless criticism. He just has a situation where he can feel at home. So I feel that would be a proper understanding about why he could be isolated, because either he's too tired, he gets exhausted, or because of the praise, or because it could lead to criticism, or it could have lead to a misplaced version of how the masses see him. So we answer that question. But now the second question, the fact that anyone who reads Matthew can't understand this verse. So let's read the verse one more time and see if we get an idea. Now, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. So I think whenever any first, second, or third century Christian read this, they wouldn't, and they didn't read Mark and Luke, they would have seen this as when you have crowds around you, you should retreat and go to the other side. And I think that's actually how almost a literal read, that's how you should read this. Jesus noted that crowds are not good for individuals, and he was trying to lead by example, according to the Matthew and read, that where's the other side? There's no lake here. The other side is the other side, the opposite of where you are. If you go to the opposite of where you are, that's how you should feel towards being with the crowds. You should have a place where you understand that it's not your job to kind of make sure that the crowds, the masses, are always hearing you. It's your job to feel this sense of solitude and isolation in order to be in the kingdom of heaven. And this is one of the things that we see Jesus push all the time. When he goes in praise, he goes in solitude. We saw that. And this is one of I think the struggles that we see for someone who takes like a communist read of the New Testament, that this attitude of individualism and isolation is definitely something that is a thread that we see. And I think that's something that, at least in the Matthean read, we see, and it perfectly we'll see in our next sessions, that it really sets this verse read this way sets the foundation for the two parables that we're not going to do today.
Thank you for the again for the background and research stuff, right, and all the nuances. Now I'm kind of intrigued, right? So you mentioned that those two rabbis where once they had praise, one of them kind of
One
forgot.
of them became excommunicated, and the
Right.
other one, it said that he lost all of his wisdom.
Yeah. What I meant to say? So in a sense, was Jesus saying the focus has to be on the kingdom of God, and so to your point, he's trying to remove the attention away from him. Now, I think further on in the Gospels, probably John, that's where they probably draw the attention. It's more Christological, but over here, to your point, he's the focus should be on the kingdom of heaven, and any instances when people are around him or people gather around him, he's moving away from it, as in not wanting that type of attention. Now, a different read could be, can I get a different perspective could be,
For sure.
um, with him, crowds coming around him, could it be that the Herod or the emperor at that time could view that as in, hey, here's somebody who is gathering crowds around him, and could view it as a form of insurrection, and was Jesus proactively avoiding that to say, I don't want to give the impression of having an insurrection or even planning that or gathering crowds, coming around. He was Jewish, having crowds come around a Jewish person, knowing that the Romans were in power.
We would be crazy to not view the idea of Jesus being mutinous or rebellious or undermining to the present society as being a factor in helping him make decisions. We don't always know. We know that he saw what happened to John the Baptist. He saw that he's living in the aftermath of that. We know that he had a very similar, if not identical, depending on how you read, message of John. So I think what you're saying, I don't know if it's correct here, but I think that we'd be wrong to not always take that into consideration for him making decisions. And if anything, when we read the Passion, the idea, it seems is like that's almost like when he stopped caring, right? where that is a situation where he stopped worrying about that mutinous perspective or that rebellious perspective or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I think that would be possible. Um, it's unclear how it's something that we have to keep our eye on about what is his relationship to the crowds. Okay, Isaac, on that note, call it a day.
Rabbi, on that note, thank you. Have a great Shabbos. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Have a great Shabbos and see you next week then.
100%. Thanks.